is an incredible moment. The future is here.
Welcome everyone to a really exciting event, to the Biosphere and the Biosphereans panel for the closing event for the Environmental Film Festival Australia. My name is Adam Grodek and I am really excited to be your moderator for this panel this evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I'm coming from today, which are the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, as well as the First Nations peoples of the lands where you may be coming from today across the globe. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people of this land were the first scientists, engineers, artists, and problem solvers, and that we still have a lot to learn from them. And I'd like to acknowledge their continuing culture, their that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that acknowledgement to any First Nations people we have joining us today. I am excited to be here with Science Gallery, who is supporting this event. I've worked as a mediator at Science Gallery Melbourne for the last 3 years since it started in Melbourne, across 3 exciting pop-up exhibitions. And Science Gallery Melbourne is a place where science and art collide, with a particular focus on 15 to 25 year olds. And I'm excited that the gallery itself will open in earnest to the public in Melbourne in 2021. So keep an eye out for that. Today's panel is going to focus on one of the documentaries that has been aired as part of the festival, called Spaceship Earth, which looks all about the Biosphere 2 project, where 8 people were essentially quarantined in a replica of the Earth's environments for 2 years. And I think that the quarantine experience will be something to explore, especially in the context of this year. But I am joined today by 3 amazing panelists who have intimate knowledge in this area, particularly around ecologies of Biosphere 2 and what it might be like to take these into space and beyond, as well as transdisciplinary areas of art and science. So it's my pleasure to introduce JJ Hastings, Janet Biggs, and Angelo Vermeulen, who will give an introduction shortly. I might actually hand over now to Janet Biggs if you would like to give an introduction about yourself to the panel.
Sure. First, I just want to say how pleased I am to be part of this panel with my fellow panelists and fellow explorers. And I want to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Lenape for me here in Brooklyn, New York, where it's now 3 in the morning and no one is sleeping because we are all anxiously, hopefully awaiting a new president. But I think I would like to share my screen and just give you a little background. Okay. So I'm a interdisciplinary artist working in film, video, installation, sound, and performance. My work often takes the form of large-scale installations with multiple screens that are synchronized. I've had the honor of working with institutions like NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and also NASA. I should be at CERN right now, but unfortunately, due to the pandemic, I'm sitting in my kitchen. Right before the pandemic, on March 6th, I was able to send a project up to the International Space Station as part of MIT Media Lab's Space Exploration Initiative. And all of this work really is in search of understanding individuals' sense of themselves, especially in the face of the extreme, be it an extreme situation, like say a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, but often an extreme landscape. My work has taken me to the high Arctic of Svalbard and around the globe, and I have seen the devastating effects of climate change, from shrinking glaciers to growing deserts of Western China. I've watched the Earth boil and burn in Ethiopia, and just erupt with noxious gases. I've seen my footsteps destroy landscapes that I really desire. And I've witnessed individuals extracting minerals from the earth that with particles that pierce their lungs and challenge their existence. I've also witnessed individuals picking up guns in lands that to defend a land that most of the population would think is unlivable, and seen governments use access to water as a tool of control due to scant resources. But, you know, through all of what I've witnessed, I always thought that I would still feel the wind across my face and the rain hit my skin until I went to Mars, or at least as close as one can get these days. The Mars Desert Research Station, which is what you're looking at now, is in Utah, and invites international crews of scientists to come together in an analog environment and conduct research here on Earth in the hope of one day being able to do the same on Mars. The scientists will don simulation spacesuits and head out of simulation airlock onto EVAs looking for any evidence, geologic evidence of water, extremophiles, any kind of evidence of life. So this is what it feels like to wear a spacesuit. It is really heavy.
Sorry to interrupt, Janet. Unfortunately, we're having some issues with the sharing of screen. We can still hear you fantastically, but we can't see the images that you're describing. So we'll see if we can sort that out shortly.
Okay. I'm going to run through this again.
So hopefully we'll bring up these really beautiful images of these missions
That's
shortly.
Discouraging.
That's all right. This is the challenges of a 2020 world, which I'm sure anyone logging in will be familiar with in the trying to get technology working. But hopefully we can have that up
okay, so
in a
you're
moment.
not getting an image.
Unfortunately. How about maybe you can describe it to us, and maybe later on we can see if we can fix that and get those images up for you.
Absolutely. So the image that I actually, because I share some of these simulations with fellow panelists, hopefully they will then supplement these images. But the images are of individuals within wearing simulation spacesuits and walking across the landscape. I'm going to try and just share screen one more time here. And application window.
Maybe while we're doing that,
Still
maybe
nothing?
we can hand over. No, nothing, unfortunately. If you want to finish talking about that, and maybe after the two other introductions, we can see if we can bring up those photos just to show before we get into the panel.
Sure. But I will just continue by saying, when you're wearing a simulation spacesuit, that it is not only physically heavy, but it is also psychologically heavy. And yes, this is simulation, but it is psychologically heavy in the idea that this is a life-sustaining garment. And once you lock that helmet into place, you know, your peripheral vision is blocked and it distorts your vision in general is distorted. Any kind of moisture inside the helmet, whether it's condensation or sweat or tears, completely blinds you. And you know, that thing that we all do, that when you run your hand over your skin to detect something that's, you know, some change, something new, that's impossible in a pressurized glove, even a simulated pressurized glove. And that thing that we all do where we run our hand over somebody else's skin, that's completely impossible. I also did a number of missions with the Mars Academy USA, which is a group of doctors trying to conduct, or they're conducting research to see how to perform surgery in deep space or on another planet, and looking at all sorts of technological developments in terms of CRISPR and 3D bioprinting. But I'm going to give you just a quick read through my journal, which is my sim journal, Sol 12, altitude 4,600 meters, Amadablam. Amadablam is in Nepal, and we ran the sim there because of the lack of altitude, or the lack of oxygen at altitude. Heart rate, 73. Blood pressure, 138/86. Oxygen, 73%. Temperature, 94.8. We're now acutely aware of our corporal bodies. We feel a bit like early mountaineers back on Earth who battled the devastating effects of altitude, brutal weather conditions, and mind-numbing isolation. It's interesting in a theoretical way to think of the ways our bodies are being affected and changed by our new home. But this isn't theory. We're now living in those harsh realities. Lactic acid accumulates, our muscles atrophy as our minds and our eyes cloud. Back on Earth, a study is being conducted using CRISPR. Instead of terraforming Mars, could we Mars form our bodies, change our DNA to accept higher levels of CO2 and radiation? For all the promise of this early research, our reality is that our bodies are slow to adapt, if they can adapt at all.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Janet. And I really look forward to asking more about your experiences, given the relevance to how relevant they are to the Biosphere 2 project. But I think we can get a similar insight and also hopefully some different experiences as well from Angelo. So I'd like to introduce Angelo, if you'd like to give an introduction to the panel.
Of course. Hi. Yeah, I'll move to my slides straight away. Just a second. Okay. All right, and then I'll go to full screen. Can you see my slide in full screen?
We certainly can.
Okay, all right. So, hi everyone. My name is Angelo Vermeulen. I'm from Belgium. I'm actually calling in from my hometown in Belgium, a tiny little town called St. Nicholas. And it's quite early in the morning here. I have a mixed background, like all of the other panelists I'm interested in transdisciplinary research. And one of the things that we share is that we've all experienced simulation missions, space simulation missions. I actually have a background in both art and science. I'm an ecologist, but I'm also a space systems researcher, and I'm a visual artist. So, and I often make links and build bridges between those different fields. I participated in the High Seas program, which is a specific space simulation program that was set up by NASA a couple of years ago on the flank of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. That location in Hawaii is actually very similar to Mars in many respects, especially the geology. The geology is, it has a kind of red soil that reminds you very much of Mars, but it's not just visually similar. The actual constitution of the soil is very much like what you would find on Mars. And so a dome-like structure has been built on the flank of the Mauna Loa volcano specifically to investigate the effects of long-term isolation on small groups of people during extended periods of time. And the second goal of this program is to investigate what kind of people you need to put together to make sure that a mission like this over extended periods of time is successful. So it's very much a a simulation mission that is focused on human aspects of going into deep space. There are quite a number of different simulation programs being run all over the world by different institutions and agencies, commercial ones and government-run ones. And it's like this, that whenever you set up a simulation program like HiSeas, as you can see here, it usually has a very particular focus. You will never find a simulation program that tries to simulate the entire experience of living on Mars with all the details. So that's really important to keep in the back of your mind. Life on the, let me get to the next slide. Life in such missions, of course, it tries to simulate the daily routines of what astronauts would experience when they would live on the surface of Mars or the Moon. And what you can see here is a number of activities that we were doing on a daily basis. I'm not going to go into details of all the different things that we did here, but generally it's a combination of scientific research, of physical exercise, and of course of socializing. And there is a lot of psychology that is brought in here, and that is really, how to put it, that is really crucial in making these missions a success. And I'm sure my other panelists have a lot to say about this as well, about all the dynamics, the group dynamics, and the psychology that is behind such a mission. And I'm sure that during our conversation we'll get deeper into this. Now, this kind of research made me wonder, or started, and how it basically brought up this whole question of how do we specifically imagine the future of mankind in deep space and in our deep futures. And the interesting thing is that a lot of us, when we think about our deep future in space, we think about a very constrained set of representations. It's very much dominated by a small set of representation that mostly come out of Hollywood, for example. I mean, these examples, I don't need to tell you, Star Trek and Star Wars are very dominant if you talk to people. And the idea is really, is this really going to be how it all looks like? And I got really interested in the quest of trying to decolonize our imagination. Is there a possibility to rethink our future and to open up that conversation and move away from, for example, these American archetypes? And so one of the projects that I've been setting up with our arts collective, because I'm operating from an arts collective that is called Seeds. We're a group of people mixing art and science and engineering. And so one of the projects we set up is called Seeker. And the Seeker project is really addressing this problem of how do communities imagine their future. And what we do is we basically engage local communities in different places in the world in rethinking how we could envision a spaceship, or more specifically, a starship, like a space architecture that would enable people to live very, very far removed from Earth for extended periods of time. And we basically combine dialogue and prototyping. And we use recycled materials to build prototypes of such potential structures. Of course, this is not aerospace engineering. This is really much more about exploring potential futures and hacking together, putting together bigger architectural prototypes. And one of the crucial aspects of the project, here you can see some of the results. This was built in a museum in Belgium. It's a large cardboard wooden structure with a full interior design. Now, one of the things that I noticed is that it's very difficult to escape those very same cliches that I talked about before. They're very deeply embedded in people. And so we often end up still referring to some of these cliches, which is quite an interesting process. A typical component, which is very relevant for today, is that we always try to embed ecosystems that partially provide food for the inhabitants of the structures. And crucially, we run our own isolation missions inside our artworks, inside the museums during these projects. We actually test what we built. And this is really crucial, because it really changes the design and creative dynamics of the group of people that are co-creating. If you're building a structure and you know that you might end up living in there, it creates a very different dynamic than if you're just creating something that is more like a prop, for example. And so this brings me to my last part of my short presentation here. my current research, my current academic research, like I said, I'm an artist and a scientist. My current academic research is really focused on interstellar exploration. And I'm actually working on new concepts for interstellar spacecraft, for starships. And briefly, the concept that I'm working on at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands is the idea of transforming an asteroid into a hybrid starship. The idea is to mine the asteroid and to use the regolith or the material of the asteroid to 3D print an expanding architecture within and outside of the asteroid. And the entire hybrid structure becomes your vessel. The idea is basically to create a structure that develops itself, which is called morphogenetic engineering. It's a form of bio-inspired engineering. We're basically using principles of growth and evolution to design these structures. So it's basically the idea that instead of a fully finished spaceship, you send a seed into space and it slowly develops itself during the course of the mission. And in order to research this, we're using all kinds of computer modeling that we connect with each other. Now, the thing is, in our computer model, we're not just looking at architecture, we're also including a virtual ecosystem, because that's the key, of course. You can have a beautiful architecture that survives a long trip, but if everything inside is dead, well, then your mission was not a success. So that's why in our computer modeling, we also included a virtual ecosystem, which essentially is based on an existing regenerative ecosystem that has been in development at European Space Agency for multiple years called Melissa. And in many ways, Melissa is very much the opposite of what we're talking about today, but I can elaborate on that later on.
Yeah, and hopefully we can bring in the differences between that work and what you've commented about, I guess, maybe some shortcomings with the Biosphere 2 project in just a moment. And I will get right into that discussion in just a moment. But I know that, JJ, you've also been involved with the High Seas project. And if I'm correct in saying you're actually currently involved with a mission that's happening right now, and it would be great to hear a little bit more about that before we jump into, and a bit more about your background before we jump into some of the discussion topics.
Sure thing, and great to hear from someone from my beloved Science Gallery Melbourne. So great to reconnect with that community there. I had the honor of being an artist in residence and being offered a period of research in residence with the Science Gallery while I was living in Melbourne. So very, very good to reconnect with my family back there in Melbourne while I'm so far away. I'm presently in Taiwan, where I've spent 2 weeks in quarantine in order to make my travel here to Taiwan possible. Like Angelo, I am a scientist as well as an artist professionally. So I professionally span 2 different worlds. I'm in Taipei for an exhibition of my work at the Digital Arts Center here in Taipei. I also am a fellow in computational biology and biophysics at Weill Cornell Medical School, where I study microbiology. So I've been following the COVID pandemic from its very inception. Interestingly enough, I had just returned from a month-long sailing voyage to Antarctica, and came back into Port in Ushuaia just to hear about the very start of its spread to the United States, including Seattle, where my family is based. So it was quite the interesting contrast to go from isolation on our most distant continent to suddenly being directly connected to a global pandemic. So I wanted to talk today. Yes, indeed, I've had the pleasure of spending some time both commanding as well as organizing missions at High Seas. I've served on a mission at Lunaris Base in Poland, which I believe, Angelo, you've had the opportunity to meet them at least or be connected. But as Angelo mentioned, there are a number of different analogs out there that are attempting to address some of our questions around what is possible to make sustainability possible, not just in space, but also on Earth. There's a very widely referred to saying, solve for space solves for Earth, vice versa, rinse, repeat. The more we can solve for extreme environments and making sure that we understand our place in ecosystems means that we'll be all the better off all around. So to that, in 2019, I founded an organization called Sensoria to address two different things. One is to address the research that goes on within these analogs to include the full embodied experience. All of our sensory experiences of being in this isolation, the lack of external environmental information that we're normally barraged with in the real Earth world, and considering or reconsidering what it is we're really hoping to do in space exploration. We have to ask ourselves why, why on Earth we would, or off Earth, we would want to remove ourselves from our comfortable womb of our natal planet. So I think asking those deeper questions of why we're going to off Earth, and then whom or what is going to be required in order to achieve that specific goal. I think moving forward for the future of our space exploration, we'll be asking ourselves less how do we do it, but why, and who is it we're wanting to send to space, send off Earth. So instead of building or selecting our humans to adapt to our environment, instead we'll be building personalized vehicles to suit the explorer. This is my prognostication. We'll see how it plays out. But I think what we're discovering now with research in human factors, who the human is and their fellow biotic voyagers are in that endeavor, are going to be of vital importance. And that includes the sensory information that they'll be collecting. So while I don't have any amazing images to share, I defer to my colleagues to share some amazing photos. I do have a video online that shows some drone footage of the habitat, including the phenomenal landscape around high seas, showing those gorgeous volcanic flows and the lava tubes that we go out and explore that hold some incredible extreme life that we continue to study.
Thank you so much for that, JJ. And I must say, when I was watching the drone footage, it really does, it's quite hard to distinguish it from the photos coming back from the rovers on Mars. It really is quite, I think, as Angelo said, for the untrained eye, it looks very similar and a great place to, I guess, train. And I also just want to mention that to anyone watching, we do hope that you're safe and are able to watch this without too much trouble, given the current situation. As we are talking about isolation and all of those things, which I think is something that we are all somewhat experienced with, voluntarily or not this year. But I wanted to jump into some questions about the Spaceship Earth documentary on which this panel is based, because I was not born when Biosphere 2, when the project happened. So for me, this was a real introduction to a project which, to be honest, I didn't know anything about until I watched this documentary, where basically 8 people are seconded inside this completely sealed, or there were some leaks, and maybe we can get into that in terms of the validity of it, but into this completely sealed, self-engineered replica of Earth for 2 years with a variety of different purposes. But while I'm watching this documentary, a bunch of, I was finding it very hard to work out, was this a science project? Some people called it science fiction without the fiction, trendy ecological entertainment, or just a different way of doing science. And as transdisciplinary artists, scientists, bringing that all together across the panel, do you think the Biosphere 2 project was an art project, a science project, entertainment, or something else? And whether that changes its value, whether it's valuable and its validity to maybe the scientific community or as people as a whole. And maybe we could, I know that Angelo and I were chatting before the panel, had some interesting experiences in this space. So maybe I'll bring you in first to comment about what your thoughts on that might be.
Yeah, I've been reflecting on Biosphere for a very, very long time. It's been fascinating. It's been interesting to me for a very long time. I'm an ecologist, so I've looked at it with this particular eye. So it is definitely entertainment for sure. I mean, people could visit the facility when the mission was ongoing and could watch the people living inside, basically like a human zoo. I think that's a pretty strong entertainment value there. But it's scientific. There's no doubt about it. There was research being done in a proper way. The thing is, there is the story that was brought out when the mission started, and then there is the actual science that came out, and there's a bit of a disconnect there. One of the reasons is that the data, and that's something you can, it's a bit of a spoiler, but that's what you can see in the movie, the data got lost. They collected data for 2 years, 8 people living in a kind of collapsing ecosystem because it didn't work out the way they thought. But nevertheless, even if the ecosystem collapses and you gather data, this is science. You understand, you start to figure out, hey, why is this system collapsing? What are the unexpected mechanisms here that we completely didn't realize? So for ecologists, whether it fails, whether it actually works and there is a blossoming Garden of Eden, it doesn't matter at all. It's really about trying to grasp the different flows of materials, the population sizes. That's what's interesting for ecologists. And so in this respect, it is definitely scientific research. However, and then I'll let my colleagues talk, the whole basic concept of Biosphere 2 was flawed from the beginning. As an ecologist, you would never build a biological regenerative ecosystem like this. It's a little crazy to do this. And why is it a little insane almost? You're basically you're miniaturizing very complex ecosystems from the real world, and you're expecting them to behave like real ecosystems. And people are depending with their life on the functioning of these miniaturized ecosystems, and that is very risky. Reducing an ocean to a swimming pool with some coral reef, that system is never going to behave like an ocean. That is something entirely different. And that's why I say maybe crazy is maybe not the best word, but it's risky, let's put it this way. They took a huge risk in depending on these miniaturized ecosystems because they would never do what an ecosystem would do.
Yeah, and I know that, Janet, you were commenting about watching some of these ecosystems, not just in a enclosed terrarium of sorts, but on a global scale collapsing. It's pretty scary, I guess, to be in an environment like that where you can see these ecosystems collapsing. But from your experiences, maybe while you're inside some of these simulations, did you feel a part of a science project or an art project or something else entirely?
You know, I think it depends on the participants' commitment. In the simulations that I have done have been as successful as the crew members' agreement to actually believe in the simulation. And it is shockingly fast how immersive that can be. So that even a short duration simulation of a couple weeks, when you first come out of sim and you take that helmet off, you truly feel like you could, like the environment is going to kill you, which is psychologically an interesting dynamic. In terms of the film, it's, I think it's obviously, it's entertainment and was entertaining when it happened, entertaining now. I think that there are aspects to a kind of art and science collaborations that happen where scientific communication is distributed to mass audiences in a very entertaining way, and so they're allowed a kind of entry point into what could be considered hard science, but it's a soft entry, and that idea of the illustrative through the arts to generate more interest in the sciences is great. But I personally think that there are much deeper levels of collaboration that can happen, but we can talk about that later. But I think it's, Biosphere 2 was so performative and performative with scientific concepts being explored. And for me, science usually, it starts with a hypothesis, and then through experimentation and rigor and research and play, that hypothesis is supported or not. And I think people from the arts end up coming at it from a kind of inverse, so that the initial, the methodology is to start with the play and the experimentation and the research. And and then hope for discovery. And I think both of those methodologies are absolutely valid. And so I find that, that Biosphere 2 sort of sat in both worlds, probably more in the artistic world, in that unfortunately the data was lost, but perhaps the structure was not sound when it initiated, but it still was, there was discovery through it.
And it certainly brings up a lot of questions. I mean, I found myself wanting to just know as much as I could about it afterwards. It's such a really out there concept, and I guess that's one of, as I think all of our panelists are experienced with in this space of art and science. And I wanted to bring you in here, JJ, because you have a really rich background in both. And especially doing that stuff now and not 30 years ago. And I think that's one of the questions is, could have this project existed now? And do you think those sorts of projects are more productive or counterproductive in terms of the way science is done? Having tried to do these simulated missions, perhaps either similarly or actually taken a different path away from what Biosphere 2 tried to do in your own endeavors?
So I think Janet has hit on exactly the point of these simulations. They're performative. So these are theaters of inquiry. They are imaginations of things to come in anticipation of them. So they're dress rehearsals. They are theatrical. So they are fiction in a way, as is running simulations of any other sort, whether computational or performed as theater. These are our staged moments to try and do an investigation in anticipation of another scenario. So as to whether it's science or art, yes. And it has to be, as is science in a way performative in the ways that theater is performative, as is theater scientific inquiry and learning scientific experimentation. All of these things are completely intertwined together and required. And I go back to the original question: why are we doing this in the first place? Biosphere 2 may have been really over ambitious. They set out an enormous goal for themselves. If you follow the group before Biosphere 2, you knew they were far more ambitious than most. They took on massive projects, building a ship that sailed the world, when none of them had ever done anything like the sort, let alone sailed. So that this was meant to be a small-scale iteration was never their aim. So in that way, Biosphere 2 was far more grandiose than perhaps most systems engineers might approach for an Eclipse or Bliss system that we would design for space. Now, as to what we do now with analogs, you have to ask the question, what are we doing the simulation for? What are we trying to learn? And what's the purpose of the simulation? We are developing a scenario in all of these simulations. So what is the scenario meant to teach us? And we have to suspend our disbelief in this theatrical staging of a simulation. And that means that we are abiding by the premises of that simulation, including communications delays, including donning specific EVA equipment to leave the habitat. Even though if you were to lift your mask, logic would tell you would experience earth, air, and atmosphere. So in some ways, it is a performative, active way of suspending your disbelief in order to learn something out of this. So is it science? Is it art? Yes, all of the above, and it should be.
It's such an interesting thing to think about, that they are almost, even the simulations of this year in some sense are performative, and I think that's a really interesting perspective on it. And I will mention now as well to our audience that we will have some time for Q&A at the end, so if you do have any questions, put them down below in the medium that you are viewing this in, and we will hopefully be able to get to some of those at the end. But I wanted to touch on something about what you were saying, JJ, that it almost seems like that there's this idea of simulation and performance is still being used. And I wanted to open this up to any of our panelists, if you want to jump in, about whether the way that this really crazy, I guess, group of people that came up with Biosphere 2, you know, doing these sea voyages, never having built a boat or been on a boat before, and building this project to the Biosphere 2. Can we take a leaf out of the way that they've tried to solve this existential problem, which they saw as collapsing ecosystems on Earth, or whether you take it as to taking ecosystems and replacing us in space? Is there a way that we can learn from them about the way they tried to solve these problems, not necessarily from a conventional scientific background, or are there pitfalls that we need to avoid that they did to make these projects actually have impact in the ways that we want to? And I'll open this up if anyone wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think, one of the things is that maybe they, I mean, it's so easy to criticize in retrospect, right? And we've been using the word crazy quite a few times, which is not fully respectful for the people who did it, because I was impressed when I watched the movie with these people, how they were a sort of counterculture and trying to break out of the mold and rethinking the world, and really fully going at it in a very American way, I have to say. It's a very American kind of way they approached it. I think as a European, that's how I perceive it, which is very inspiring. I mean, it is an inspiring group of people, and they had the guts to try and do it. The thing is, it's basically what JJ already indicated. They probably made a too big of a leap. Before they built the final version of Biosphere 2, they built a small prototype, but that was just one room. It was just one space. And then they immediately jumped to this big, massive complex. And that was probably the pitfall where, you know, but one of the things we can definitely learn is, I think with all the good intentions and all the admiration for ecosystems on Earth and the richness of Earth, I think we underestimate the way we can control nature and what true complexity really means. Nature, well, of course, through agriculture and through biotechnology, we have gotten to this into this idea, this illusion that we're perfectly capable of molding nature our way, and then this is a repudiation of this whole thing. And it's due to complexity. Complexity sign, and I'm talking about complexity not just as something complicated, because something complicated is something else than something complex. Complex systems are systems that contain many individual elements that in themselves might be very simple, but because of their interactions, all kinds of unpredictable patterns emerge. And this is called post-normal science. It's a new step in science. We come from an era historically with a more Newtonian view on the world, where everything could be put together like little building blocks, and you turn the world is a clockwork, and you just put it together, and that's it. And what this showed us, that this is not enough to understand the world. And we need to embrace complexity science, and we need to dive deeper into this kind of approach of understanding the world and rebuilding the world. And just to conclude, if you want to build a complex solution for a complex problem, you can't build it. You have to build a system where the solution builds itself gradually over time. That's really the way to deal with complex problems. Our minds are too small, even with computers, to build complex solutions.
And there are a couple of questions which we'll hopefully get to that actually do touch on that area. And I want to open up some further comments from both of you, Jeanette and JJ. But I'd be really interested to know as well whether your opinion on this topic has changed because you actually have experienced, in a sense, a mission that maybe a reduced mission in terms of length, but actually having been inside an isolation mission simulation, whether that changes your perspective on this area, I guess.
I'd actually like to hear from Janet, from her experience in MDRS, because that is a facility I haven't had the privilege of experiencing yet.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it, and to take Angela's point that is very American, the endeavor and the film. I feel that I can talk about this with authority.
Okay.
You know, I do think there is something about John Allen, that this charismatic figure, and I'll get to MDRS, but you know, this incredibly charismatic figure that that looks at individual exceptionalism, and we hold that dear in this country, not for the best reasons. But I also think, you know, that something like a government agency like NASA has their own structure and their own working methods, which unfortunately, because they're government supported, often go to the lowest bidder. And then you can look like an individual who is charismatic, like Elon Musk in private sector, that's building a different structure. And in the best worlds, they work in concert, and as they are right now, and feeding off of each other. And so I find that, you know, it's again back to the complexity, right? So individuals are so incredibly complex. Biological structures are incredibly complex, as we are part of that. But the hard science versus the social sciences and the human dynamic is one of the things that I found most interesting at Mars Desert Research Station, and honestly at every simulation I've done, which is, you know, MDRS is set up in short duration. It has, while I absolutely, you know, 2 weeks of living in a confined environment, gave me, I know about high seas durations, and then you look at Biosphere 2 and that duration, and I can't help but admire. And, you know, can you classify it as crazy? Perhaps some would, I don't. But I think living within that, to watch the social hierarchy develop so strongly and then disintegrate potentially the project. And I've experienced that, you know, the more successful missions are when that is inevitable, you're going to have conflict, but whether you can work through the conflict, and that's all about crew dynamics and who you bring on board.
Did you have similar experiences yourself, JJ, about the human, I guess, element to these missions? Is it something that you think was considered in the Biosphere 2 project, and should it be considered in these sort of projects, I guess?
Yeah, I guess what I found most interesting were the choices around crew dynamics in Biosphere, because they actually were fairly well acquainted and really well prepared for the environment before going in, much more than most people that do go into these simulation missions that the three of us have gone on. Angelo, I think, is the one with the longest experience, or has been on the longest duration mission. He was on the very first mission at high seas, and I believe that was 4 months, with some very good friends of mine. So Angelo can talk a bit more about the experience of longer duration experience of human factors. But I think Janet is absolutely on point. Humans are the biggest risk to the system, to be honest. We're the greatest variable. And so the lessons we learn on human psychology, social psychology, and resilience in confined spaces, including Concordia Station in South Pole, those that overwinter in the Antarctic, are really going to be those that can give us the most sort of information about how to survive living off Earth for years and years, or living on station for years and years. So I'm really interested to actually hear what Angelo has to say.
Yeah, I lived in high seas for 4 months, 120 days with 5 other people that actually we did not really know each other very well. We did some training before we went in, but it's not like we were close friends or anything. So we got to learn each other during the mission. And I was the commander of the mission. So it was my responsibility to figure out how to make this work. I mean, that's how it felt like to me as a commander. And basically, without going in too much detail, because I can talk for hours about this, as you can imagine, you don't want to employ a military commander kind of style in these situations. That is not going to work. And I think everybody in this panel probably experienced this as well. You're working with highly autonomous individuals, scientists and engineers that really know very well what needs to be done. They're used to work on their own projects. You can't just order them around in the morning. That's not how that works. So you basically need to develop a sort of facilitating kind of leadership. And it's actually the first time I heard about it was when a Belgian astronaut, Frank de Winne, was talking about this in a talk that I attended. He was the commander of the International Space Station for 6 months. And he talked about this. He was like, I was really focused on removing as many obstacles for the individual people in the crew as much as I could. That was my role. My role was not to start telling everybody every little thing what they needed to do. And that's something that I embraced as well. Now, it's interesting when you think about leadership in these contexts, because that's something that is not very clear. The leadership within in the movie, you don't really get a good feeling for that, about the leadership structure there and the decision making. But there are two types of leadership that have been discovered in these kind of simulation missions and space missions. Some leaders are operational oriented and some people are more emotional supportive. And operational oriented means that a leader is constantly focusing on what needs to get done. Let's get it done quick and well. Let's stay on schedule. And that's the priority of the whole experience. Emotional supportive leadership is more about making sure that the crew is in good shape, emotionally, psychologically, and there is a good cohesion. Now, it seems that the best type of leadership, and I'm not saying that I was fully successful in this, but I tried, is when you know when to switch. Sometimes these people in this particular pressure, psychological pressure, a huge task load, they need operational leadership. And at that moment, they don't want to hear a leader who's like, let's talk about how we feel today. And people are like, no, let's get this done. The other hand, when it gets really tough emotionally, you don't want a leader that just keeps on banging, like, come on, people, we need to get this done. And you want somebody who is understanding, empathic, right? And so this is also reflected in literature. There is research on this. And this honestly, the whole high seas experience and all, I was also part of the MDRS. For me personally, on a very personal level, I learned most about leadership because of this experience. And this has been pretty much life-changing for me.
Maybe that's something that we can open up to Janet, you as well. Like, what was the thing that you would say you learned the most from one of these, being in these extreme environments? What was some of your biggest takeaways from actually putting yourself in this situation rather than looking at it from a position like myself, watching other people do it?
Sure. I'm going to, again, kind of echo both JJ and Angelo in that the structure of leadership, and you were both commanders. I was, a lowly crew member in all my missions, and prefer that role, honestly. But in one of the missions that I did, which was with the Mars Academy USA, we actually addressed governance as a crew before we even went into sim, and talked about, do we want to maintain the military hierarchical style of leadership, or do we want to work on consensus? And exactly that, how those would become operational within the mission. And we chose consensus for one of our crews, and it was a short cruise, so I can't give you, I feel like I have no data to actually support that notion, and I think it depends on the crew dynamics anyway. But it was a really interesting proposition to not, to discuss before you go into the sim, how exactly you want to be governed.
I'll also chime in here to say just quickly that I think the biggest communication breakdowns that tend to happen are between flight control and the crew itself.
Exactly.
And we saw this play out quite well, quite well elucidated in the film, between the priorities that happen back on Earth and whatever's happening within the habitat and the crew. There's just this communication gap, this sensory gap even, of being able to read the room, read the hab of what's happening with the crew, really, that just exists. And I think that is one of the most important questions we'll have to address if we're leaving Earth. How much autonomy do we really confer to the crew? And how do we actually support that autonomy and simply defer to their needs? So that they're really more commanding rather than the sort of traditional flight control that is commanding everything from the ground up.
Yeah, it's actually I totally agree with this, and it's interesting that this phenomenon where mission control, Houston, is getting into discussions, even fights with the actual crew doing the mission over particular research topics or any aspect of the mission. It's called displacement, and which I find a very tricky way to call it, because they call it displacement. Space psychologists have started calling it displacement because they say that it's the tensions that are present within the crew are being projected onto mission control. But that is just a theory. I mean, it's like putting all the blame on the crew. It's probably more complicated than this, and I think in these times of the pandemic, I think we've all experienced similar frustrations when we're working with a remote team or authority like your boss on remotely, and you can get really frustrated because they don't fully understand what you're going through, and these miscommunications just start piling up and then suddenly explode in some big discussion.
And I think something interesting on this human element, like you're talking about, especially, I think a lot of us have experienced what it's like to communicate remotely like this. But someone from the audience has also pointed out that we've talked about having diverse ecosystems as part of the Biosphere project, but in reflection, especially with a lens in 2020, that the participants were not very ethnically diverse, and perhaps people would have been expecting not just a group of white scientists, but maybe people from all walks of life. I think there's a comment in the documentary about someone saying, imagine if they had me, a black girl from New York, in there, I think things would be a little bit different. So what are your thoughts about having people from a more diverse background in these crewed scenarios or in the Biosphere 2 project? How does that change the way this works as a scientific mission, or as well from a human element as well? And I know that, JJ, you've done some one of the things you're involved with looks at bringing in a more diverse background to this space, if that's correct.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. That is the stated mission of Sensoria.space. That's the Sensoria program's primary aim, is to give women and those from historically subjugated or otherwise underprivileged statuses a platform to advance their careers in the space sector. Part of this is that we don't know what we don't know, right? Beyond tokenism of, ticking boxes, we don't know what we don't know about the differences of experience of those people in space. How our upbringing, our bodies themselves are different in these different scenarios. So beyond just Earth-based simulations and analogs, moving into zero and fractional gravity, into isolated confined spaces with only a few people, and remote isolation from Earth, being completely autonomous. We don't know yet what we don't know in terms of what's required to really be resilient and be able to endure space. So that is the stated aim of the Sensoria program, is to give more people that haven't had an opportunity in the sort of traditional heritage programs, but then also begin to reconsider what the profile of someone who is suitable or desirable for space exploration might be.
Yeah, and there's also the question of crew composition. If you put together a crew, you want things to be complementary. So even if you apply for a mission and you don't get selected, it's not because you're not properly suited for a mission, it's because you didn't fit in. I think that's really important. And so the whole idea of diversity is really crucial for building resilient systems. You want a diverse crew. You want a crew with a multidisciplinary background, different people ticking different boxes in terms of knowledge and background and skills. But also ethnically and culturally, it is very interesting to bring that to the mix. Now, for example, in my mission, we had a quite interesting mix. There was African-American, Russian-American, European, Canadian, Caucasian, Puerto Rican. So that was like really a nice little mix of backgrounds, but we were still all Western. So there was some common ground, and that's where it gets tricky. You can start mixing different cultures and different backgrounds, but at a certain point, the differences might become big and difficult to bridge. We saw that, for example, in the Mars 500 experiment, which happened in Russia. It was a collaboration between Russia and Europe, where people were locked up for 500 days, like a huge mission. And the Chinese person gradually started disconnecting from the group. I can't say that's because of his cultural background, but there seemed to be some disconnect with the rest of the group. So, and key here is, if there is a sweet spot. You need diversity for a resilient mission, for a resilient capacity to tackle problems and to keep things interesting. But at a certain point, things might become complex. And so I think facilitation is key here. And that's probably one of the roles of the commander, to make sure that this person can facilitate these differences between the group and maximize the potential of the group.
But I do think there's some fundamental structures in place that certainly fight against diversity and access. And we're again looking at institutional structures of racism, and those have to be addressed for certainly a future I want to see. And even our panel, we are we certainly are we are pretty white. And I think that it's I was part of a project that talked about trying to democratize space, and in those words sound great. The reality is, do you know how much money? And this was access to the International Space Station, and the reality is that was so limited. It came out of a rarefied university, and it was only offered to a certain group of people. And so I champion your projects that are actively working to change that future.
And I know that there's been some comments from the audience about thought experiments about what these diverse backgrounds may look like in sci-fi or in literature. Someone suggested Ben Elton's The Other Eden, if any of our panelists have read that. I know Kim Stanley Robinson's The Mars Trilogy, or even The Expanse, which is a current book and TV series as well. They do explore a lot of these ideas in science fiction as well. Maybe a question about where, and this came from the audience as well, about where the three of you get your ideas from, whether you are inspired by any of these, any projects through films that you may have seen. Maybe you may pick it up in other media as well, but also maybe you could comment about this idea of the counterculture that Biosphere 2 sort of existed in, about real experimentation at the fringes of the mainstream, whether that's something you, or maybe you can comment about how that process interacts with what you do in your projects.
Who wants to start?
So as someone who's part of the counterculture as a hacker, I mean, that's just, my default nature is to start from the fringe. You notice how quickly that counterculture became mainstream and gentrified into a commercial entity and then conformed into an academic endeavor. So what starts as counterculture can very quickly be co-opted if it seems successful or meets the criteria of another institution or structure. But absolutely all of our new ideas by default exist at the fringe. They have not yet existed nor been adopted. So but this came out of a theater group in the late 60s, early 70s in, the Castro district in San Francisco. That does not surprise me in the least. That they ended up with enough funding to actually build the structure and execute this mission, for better or for worse. That to me is gobsmacking. I mean, it's extraordinary to me.
I think Janet, go ahead.
Maybe we'll get Janet first on this.
I think those cracks and the glitches and the fringe are exactly what you say, JJ, that those are the areas where speculative design action really happens. And I look a lot at the pandemic right now, and we're obviously seeing the effects of everyone staying inside on our ecosystem. But I worry that this isn't a big enough disruption and that we're just going to go back to our old ways as soon as we possibly can. And so it's the same that you're saying, like it's co-opted into, popular culture, mainstream, or academia so quickly. And so it is really important to keep fighting for those cracks and trying to wedge into them and broaden them.
Maybe, Angela, I'll get you to mention what you're going to say, but I'll jump back to some comments about thinking about this stuff in terms of the pandemic. But Angelo, I'll get you to jump in there.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to connect with the topic that JJ raised, which is the hacking. I think hacking is really a key component here. It's
Do you maybe want to define what you mean by hacking,
yes,
for the audience? Yeah.
So basically what we embrace with our collective, with the Seeds Collective, is a hacking ethos. And the whole idea about hacking here is not, of course, getting credit card details over the internet and robbing people. It's there is also something called hardware hacking. And I really believe hardware counterculture is very much related to hacking, just like JJ introduced, because hacking is really the attitude of opening up systems, rethinking them and repurposing them, and seeing potential applications and seeing potential in objects and relationships that are different than what we're conditioned for. And it requires some practice. It doesn't come easy, because society really pushes you to use this device in this way, and when you're in public space to behave like this. But there are all kinds of hacking systems. For example, parkour. People running in cities in very unexpected ways. That's a perfect example of hacking. It's hacking the city. It's hacking the infrastructure of the city. So I think what they did in Biosphere 2 is really moving away from the established paradigms and stepping into this new idea of let's just bring the whole world together in a miniature version and use that as a new model to build our future, which of course didn't fully work out, but it's that stepping outside of mainstream thinking. And honestly, I'm not so worried that particular results from hacking or particular hacking actions become mainstream. I think that's a good thing. It's just that we need to keep that attitude at all times, and especially in a future where we're getting more and more technological controls, everybody should be taught how to hack, how to embrace that hacking attitude. And it's not something that should just be done by artists and people working in the cultural field. It should be something that we all embrace to counter control through technology.
It's a really great call to action, I guess, to take lessons out of the Biosphere project. I think because we are unfortunately almost out of time, I might get you to do a wrap up in a moment, but I did also want to ask, I'm noticing someone asking about whether people, if you've had the opportunity to train in isolation for so long, whether that changed your resilience to the pandemic, particularly in the isolation in Melbourne, or if compared to people with no prior knowledge. I'm not sure if there's any research on that, but we might jump to this last question about, well, because a lot of your missions have focused on replicating Mars and sending people to Mars, someone's asked, do you think we'll get to Mars before Earth becomes inhabitable? And I might throw that out, and then maybe we can get everyone to do a quick wrap up after that. So any of you who've been, maybe Angela, you've been involved, I guess, in trying to look at getting humans off Earth in that in environments that are sustainable. Do you think that we can get to Mars before Earth becomes uninhabitable?
Yeah, I'm not expecting Earth to become uninhabitable, to be honest. I'm pretty optimistic. I think we're probably going to create a lot of mess on Earth. We're going to mess up Earth maybe even more. But uninhabitable, honestly, the most difficult regions on Earth right now are still way easier to survive in than anything on Mars. So there's still a big difference there. So no, I don't think we're going to make Earth inhabitable. And when we're getting to Mars, there's this running joke in the space community that it's always 30 years ahead, right? It's always in the 70s, it was going to happen in 2000. In 2000, it's going to happen in 2030. And we're still in that stage. I think honestly, the focus right now is on the moon And that's what's going to happen in the next 10 years. We're going to start inhabiting the moon full on, and I'm very excited about this as well.
JJ or Janet, do you have any thoughts on this as well that you'd like to add?
I guess I'd add uninhabitable to whom. we are very, very late in the evolutionary game of our planet. Our predecessors, our microbes, precede us by hundreds of millions of years. So I tend to joke, really, I think our bodies are simply spaceships already for microbes, where we evolved around to make them travelers. That's a whole other thesis to explore. But the question has to be inhabitable for whom? Uninhabitable for humans to be sustainable at our current population levels. Yeah, that's very likely 30 years out from now. That is very likely. But as Angelo said, if we can manage to live at the very top of Mount Everest for however many years and survive that, maybe we should think about going to Mars. But let's stick to the moon for now and see how possible that is.
Which is a current NASA project to establish a continuous human habitation on the moon, I believe, as part of the Artemis project. Janet, did you want to add anything to what JJ and Angelo have said on this? Do you have any different ideas?
I agree very much, inhabitable to whom, and will just very briefly say that my interest in simulations, and specifically the Mars project, started when I was filming in the Horn of Africa, and I was watching Yemeni refugees come across a strait to what looked like an uninhabitable refugee camp. And at the same time, there were Ethiopian migrants that were fleeing, the unlivable conditions that they were enduring to get on the same boats to go back to Yemen, because going to war seemed like more hope to them. And so I was watching this cross current of humanity, all in pursuit of hope and new possibility. And it made me start thinking about, if that's one end of the spectrum, what would the other end look like? And to my mind, it was the Mars project. And these are not disconnected. So again, uninhabitable for who? To who?
What a really, I guess, profound thing to finish on. So before we finish up, I'd love to get maybe one sentence from each of you about what you think the lesson might be from Biosphere 2, in your own opinion. I'll give you a second to think about that, but I may throw to JJ first on that one. So what's one sentence do you think is the lesson you would take out of the Biosphere 2 project?
I think we need to begin to think of our vehicles for space exploration less as tin cans, but rather ecosystems that take care of us and that we can take care of.
And what do you think, Janet? What would your one sentence takeaway? I know it's impossible to sum this project
can I
up
do
in one
two,
sentence.
please? I'll make a long sentence.
Hyphenation. Run on sentence.
I think that collaboration is essential, but collaboration needs to be generative of each other and have substance within individual fields. And we need way better spacesuits.
Yes. Technology is a big factor in this. Angelo, what do you think the lesson might be in one sentence?
I think my lesson is really related to climate change and also basically to the idea that nature cannot be tamed like this, not in this way. We need to be more humble, but we also need to use the right framework. And like I talked about, the complexity framework is a more appropriate way of looking at nature, and a more humble way of trying to understand nature.
What are three fantastic perspectives to finish on. This discussion honestly could continue for hours. We've barely even scratched the surface, but I did want to say a huge thank you, JJ Hastings, Angelo Vermeulen, and Janet Briggs, for joining us today across, I think we're now in 4 different time zones to make this all possible. So a big thank you to the three of you. I'd also like to thank the Environmental Film Festival Australia for making this possible, supported by Science Gallery Melbourne, which again is opening up in 2021. And thank you to everyone watching and for submitting some of your amazing questions. I apologize for not being able to get to all of them, but hopefully we were able to get to several of them and have quenched some of your curiosity into this area. If you are interested in viewing some more of the Environmental Film Festival Australia documentaries, they are still live until November 8th. So feel free to go onto their website and check those out. Highly recommended, especially the Spaceship Earth documentary if you haven't already. But again, and hopefully from you, the audience as well, please extend a big thank you to our 3 panelists. And this panel will be viewable on demand for the next couple of days on various streaming platforms from the organisation too. So keep an eye out of that and share with friends, family and colleagues. Thank you so much, JJ, Angelo and Janet, for your insights. And I hope everyone has enjoyed this panel.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.